The period of American history that lasted about 60 years, from the second half of the 19th century to the 1920s, was called the Wild West. The name came about for a reason: lawlessness, the growth of crime, conflicts with the indigenous population, unauthorized settlements. All this was happening on the western frontier of America. Contemporaries perceive the era of the Wild West quite differently. Romantic adventures and sheriffs with a big star on their clothes, bravely leading the fight against gangs. Handsome cowboys, dashing on horseback and attracting the eyes of girls. Paleface wars with Indians and the taming of mustangs. But romantic notions of the Wild West often diverge from reality. In the 1860s, the Western territories began to be actively settled. People were attracted to the desert lands and gold mines of California. During the same period, the era of American cowboys began. Huge herds of feral bulls were moving across Texas, which had to be corralled into pens and released for grazing at certain times. This is how the first horse herders, who became famous all over the world as cowboys, appeared. The work required endurance, vigor, and toughness. Often the men would stay in the saddle for days at a time. They drove cattle from area to area and delivered animals to railroad stations. On the American prairies, attacks on cowboys by bandits or Indians were commonplace. Therefore, the Colt and the Winchester were the constant companions of the herdsmen. Days in the saddle, overnight stays, close proximity to the cattle. These factors clearly affected the appearance of cowboys. Their work was not only monotonous, but dirty and very hard. Their clothes were impregnated with the odor of horses and herd animals, which was very difficult to exterminate. Men did not know how and did not consider it necessary to take care of their bodies and clothes. In winter they did not wash for months, and in summer they just dipped in the rivers. Clothes were not washed at all. They were replaced by other clothes when they were completely worn out. The accumulation of dirt on the body contributed to the fact that at the slightest damage to the skin, a person could start a serious inflammatory process. Not only people were dirty, but also horses. They needed a lot of water and detergents to take care of them. There was neither. The heat of the prairies aggravated the condition of the horses, for whom regular washing was essential. The animals were often fed with stale water. The thick layers of dirt caused the pores on the skin to close, and the horses became sick and died before their natural age. An interesting contradiction is that the Redskins, whom Europeans treated with contempt and disdain, were much cleaner than the conquerors. They regularly performed ablutions in streams and lakes, and the pungent, unpleasant odor emanating from the colonists struck them unpleasantly. The Indians were also struck by the Europeans' handkerchiefs carried in their pockets, which were soaked with nasal secretions. Attempts by the natives to persuade the Paleface to observe body hygiene led to nothing, and the Indians fell victim to new and deadly diseases brought to them by the colonists. The natives were not immune to the germs to which the Europeans were accustomed. More than 50% of the Indians died not in wars, but from imported diseases. Women who settled in the Wild West also didn't care much about body cleanliness. Everything that had to do with water caused awe among Europeans. The centuries-old prejudice that germs are transmitted through water was firmly planted in their heads. Europeans considered underwear to be an indicator of cleanliness. They changed it often enough and were sure that all dirt and sweat secretions were transferred to the fabric. Outerwear never knew what it was like to be washed. It was scrubbed with brushes and stains were removed. Special armpits were invented for women to protect their clothes from traces of sweat. Unpleasant odor ladies skillfully masked perfume water and powder. Men used cologne, which was infused with orange blossoms and at least a little bit interrupted the unpleasant amber. Gradually, when it became clear that the lands of the Wild West were being actively developed, people of narrow specialties began to come there. Barbers came, who not only performed their duties, but also became dentists at the same time. The settlers, and cowboys among them, began to realize that cleanliness of body, beauty, and masculinity are closely related. Barbers not only gave haircuts, but also washed their hair, shaved, and even cleaned their teeth, which were in terrible condition at that time. Toothpastes were not available to many people, and barbershops had tooth powder and some sort of brushes. The barber had such talents that he could even extract a tooth from a sufferer. The Indians were much more careful and responsible about the cleanliness of their teeth. They had special devices in the form of sticks with twisted rags. They chewed fresh herbs, mint, thus freshening their breath, and even whitened their teeth with charcoal. Europeans didn't bother with such complications. Washing the head was, of course, a serious challenge. There were no shampoos in the modern sense. Hair was not washed with ordinary water, and poor quality soap made the scalp itchy and flaky. Skillful people invented a composition that coped with hair pollution. They mixed whiskey and castor oil. The alcohol dissolved the grease, and the castor oil moisturized the skin and relieved dryness and irritation. The first settlers in the Wild West had no shelter of their own. They were forced to live in hotels. The rooms were so crammed that there was no room to move. No one ever thought of beds. They slept on mattresses stuffed with straw. Sleeping places quickly became damp. They instantly harbored various insects, which did not let them sleep and spread infection. American attempts to invent soap did not help in keeping clean, and even led to the opposite effect. They made it from animal fat, but the soap was very badly washed off with cold water. Hot water was unheard of. It left a greasy film on the body, which caused irritations and inflammations on the skin. The illiterate Westerners thought this was due to washing, and tried to use water even less often. It was difficult with the toilets. There was such a stench around the wooden stalls that few people dared to go near them. Any green spaces became latrines. An interesting invention was invented in saloons. The owners of the first beer bars in the Wild West tried to keep their establishments clean and orderly. It wasn't easy. Cowboys, gold diggers, and traders came to saloons to relax and unwind after long and hard work. They drank immense quantities of whiskey, shouted, argued, and fought. In the bars, each customer was given a spittoon to keep spit off the floor. They were metal bowls of sawdust. No one cleaned the spittoons. The sawdust absorbed saliva, swelled, then dried up again. The fumes from these bowls and the stale air made many saloon customers suffocate. Also in bars there was such a hygiene item as towels. They hung at the entrance and were intended for blotting beards, on which whiskey was spilled abundantly. Every visitor, on leaving the saloon, wiped the vegetation on his face. And since the towels were never washed, the odor was corresponding. No one was embarrassed by this fact. Dirt and unpleasant odors were taken for granted. The beginning of the 20th century brought significant changes in the life of the Wild West. Society was becoming more civilized. Houses were being built with running water and sewers. People began to develop habits of keeping their bodies clean and bathing regularly. Medical propaganda did its job. Fear of water was left behind. The new generation of settlers used every possible means to maintain hygiene. The Wild West was no longer wild. Modern states were formed on the Western territory of America, which safely exist today.